Howdy, boys and girls. Welcome back to Mr. Herring's fifth grade social studies. Glad you can join me today. We will be continuing. So ecstatic to be in Unit 2 now, talking about the history of our country. We will start with the problem with Jamestown today. We are continuing Unit 2, exploration and colonization. So let's talk a little bit about Jamestown and the problems the initial colony had from the beginning. So our essential question today is, why was the original Jamestown landing and attempt at settlement a failure? Today, I can explain why the Jamestown settlement failed at its first attempt to create a productive and successful settlement. That is our unanswered question for this lesson. So let's go ahead and get started. Before I do, let's break the ice real quick with a joke. Hey, I told my dad I'd call him later. You know what he said? He said, he looked at me strange and said, "I'd rather you call me dad, dummy." Ha ha ha. Pretty funny, right? Okay. All right. So Jamestown. The very first Jamestown trip, 1607, King James funds and finances a trip to the New World. The reason they were coming, they had heard all these wonderful rumors about the Spanish explorers finding all this great amount of gold in our country. And this was a really big deal because it's a very competitive world. Everyone's competing with their um, each other to be the best empire they possibly could be. And so the English didn't, they wanted to get in on it. They didn't want to feel like they were behind. So I have here a list, the passenger list of the first and second trip to Jamestown. The first in 1607, and then again in 1608, 1609 was the resupply mission. So if you look at this first set here, and it's really interesting, if you look at the first list, look at the occupations that were in this list and the number of people they sent. The first one that stands out to me is council or governors. They had six of them. Six council or governors and 110 people. Now, if you think about the state of Texas, we've got roughly 30 million people or so, and we've got one governor. And 110 people on this boat, there were six governors. There were 47 gentlemen, and if I look down here, this note, a gentleman was a person of wealth who was not used to working with his hands. So this is somebody I think would be, today we consider them a professional, someone who went to college, a lawyer, a doctor, someone who works in politics, Congress, what have you, things like that. Business people, people who work in offices. They don't work outside, they don't use their hands, they don't build things, that's for sure. And if I continue down this list, there were 12 laborers. We know a laborer is someone who does manual labor, hard work. We had some carpenters, that's people who build houses and things like that. We have a blacksmith. We have a sailor. Now, a sailor is not the person on the boat. A sailor is someone who makes a sail for the boat. We had one barber. We had a bricklayer. And we had a mason. Now, a mason works with rock, stones, things like that. No pipe makers. We had one tailor. We had a drummer, because you know, we've got to have a drummer. We had one preacher. We had four boys. Now, when I say boys, I'm thinking very young boys, because the average age of these passengers was 17 to 35. So when they say boys, I'm thinking really young boys. No jewelers, no goldsmiths, no gunsmiths, no perfumers, which is a wig maker, no apothecaries, which is like a pharmacist, someone who messes with medicine. And then we had one surgeon. It's a big deal. And of the 110 people, 28 of them, we did not know their occupation. That was the first trip. Now, if you look at this list, surely you can notice something strange. If you're coming to the New World, is this the group of people you want? Is this the group of people you want on the boat to make sure that your trip is successful? Are these the occupations that you really want to make sure your trip is successful, right? When I look at that, I don't really see a lot of success. If you're planning on surviving forever, can you predict any problems they may have had? You can pause the video and think about that for a second. Just look over this list. So the resupply wasn't much different. There were a few differences, a few changes, but the resupply wasn't all that different. Instead of sending six governors, this time they only sent one. We had half the number of gentlemen, roughly, and about double the number of laborers. We did get a barrel maker this time. We did get a blacksmith, another blacksmith. We didn't get any sailor, any barbers, any bricklayers, any masons, but we did get a pipe maker. I wonder why. What do you think they found in this new world that may have convinced them they needed a pipe maker? We got 6 tailors because everybody needs nice clothes. I think this nice clothes thing probably goes back to these two positions, the governor and the gentleman. We had no drummers, no preachers, no boys, 1 jeweler, 1 goldsmith, 1 gunsmith, 1 wig maker. We had 2 druggists because people were getting sick and died. We had 1 surgeon, and 51 people were unknown this time. Now, if you look about the surgeon's a big one. We have to have a surgeon because the second trip, out of the 110 on the first trip, over 70 of them died, which is a huge percentage. So we needed more people. We needed more surgeons to help out with the sickness that was going on. Okay? All right. So here's the article I want to read. And you can follow along with me. You'll answer questions about this at the end in the Schoology assessment. So early Jamestown, why did so many colonists die? In the spring of 1607, 3 English ships carrying more than 100 passengers sailed into the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and worked their way up the James River. Hopes were high, and with good reason. This was to be the first permanent English settlement in the New World. A strong group of English investors stood behind the enterprise. The King of England, James I, had given the colonizers the blessing. Along the river banks, one could see fresh water streams, fair meadows, and goodly tall trees. Ahead lay possible riches, a native population to be taught the ways of Jesus Christ, and maybe even a hidden trade route to China. True, there were dangers. A Spanish warship or 2 would not be a surprise. Also, the English had experienced a recent failure on nearby Roanoke Island. In fact, all the Roanoke colonists had mysteriously disappeared. But in 1607, these were acceptable risks. What was probably more important is that the fair meadows and goodly tall trees of the Chesapeake were not empty. Some 15,000 Powhatan Indians lived in a small village along and around the James River. They were loosely ruled by a great chief named Wahunna-sun-a-cock. One of Wahunna-sun-a-cock's daughters was the fabled Pocahontas, a very real person who would one day marry an Englishman and sail to England. When the English settlement arrived, they built a fort on a place they called James Island. This was to become Jamestown. Of the 110 original settlers, only 40 would be alive at the end of December. The arrival in January of a resupply ship saved the colony from total collapse. But in the next 2 years, hard times continued. Captain John Smith, who had provided much-needed leadership, was sent back to England. Then, in the awful winter of 1609-1610, 2/3 of the settlement died. Remarkably, the English kept coming, men, women, and children. The vast majority were young, 17 to 35, and most were poor. They helped to work off their debt and one day own a piece of land. A few arrived with money, and some would one day find success growing tobacco. But for most, there was no happy ending. By 1611, of the more than 500 settlers who had arrived in Jamestown, 80% were dead. It is truly amazing that the colony survived. Those English, both in Jamestown and back in the mother country, were a determined bunch. Our focus, however, is not on the survival, but on the near destruction. So if you listen to this passage, it might be a little easy to decide why they weren't successful. If you look at that passenger list, that definitely helps us understand why they weren't successful. So your job is to think about what led to the failure or the initial failure of Jamestown. Think about that in reviewing this lesson. Feel free to go back and listen to it again and think what exactly caused the failure of Jamestown, the initial failure. Now we know it was successful later on. John Smith came in, took over, put everybody to work and fixed things, but it was a failure its first attempt. Okay, so when you are done with that, go ahead and back in my Schoology page, you'll find the Schoology assessment, answer some questions, and then I will see you back in class. Have a great afternoon, guys.